Students, parents, educators and politicians all want to know how government's free higher education plan will work. We're joined by a man many believe to be the mastermind behind the plan. M Masutha is Director of the Centre for Emerging Researchers and joins us in the studio now. And welcome to the programme, Mr. Masutha. Thanks so much for coming in. I want to go back a few months, first of all, to the story that broke in the Sunday Times claiming that you had introduced a plan to President Jacob Zuma and to Cabinet suggesting that higher education could be introduced virtually immediately by borrowing from various other areas of the fiscus, and that Cabinet had essentially heard you out on this particular issue. Is the plan we are looking at, the plan that President Jacob Zuma presented at the ANC elective conference a few weeks ago, is that essentially your plan?
No, not at all. In fact, the Sunday Times article can be characterized as nothing short of fake news. If you go back to 2007, the ANC said that poor and working class students must enter universities for free until undergraduate. If you fast track to Mangaung, the ANC was now impatient with itself. It says, finalize the free higher education plan by 2013 and phase in free higher education for poor and working class students by 2014. That didn't happen. Fees Must Fall started in 2015. I am but a mere researcher who presented to the Fees Commission with a list of a lot of other researchers who presented there. A few weeks later, we were invited to present to the IMC on higher education, where we presented our interpretation of what needs to be an alternative to the current commodification of higher education. What you see as an announcement of government is a combination of what government's interpretation of all evidences presented to the Fees Commission and ultimately processed by government believes is the right way forward. So it's not my plan. In fact, I always tell people that when free higher education was placed on the Freedom Charter, my mother was not even born yet. So it's impractical and frankly fake news to even try to attribute it to myself.
So how does your plan differ from the one President Jacob Zuma has announced?
Oh, there are many ways in which it differs. For example, we didn't believe that higher education must be interpreted as a cost to the state. Any developmental state worth its salt will never list education as a cost, but rather a social investment with well-known economic, social and cultural returns. If anything, we were of the view that the continued commodification of higher education is underpinned by the neoliberal approach which dates back to 1994 up until now, and that free higher education was long overdue. So there's a whole host of issues that we proposed. If you pull our presentation to the Fees Commission, you'll be able to see, for example, we believe that all NSFAS debt must be wiped off, because not only is the repayment rate at 4.7%, but the fact that we've been imposing loans on people whose parents earn a combined annual household income of 122,000 rand is in itself a crime. There are many things, none of that was done. So there are many ways in which it wasn't done. What you are witnessing here, however, is a number of defenders and beneficiaries of the current multi-billion rand loan scheme who are kicking and screaming because when the president's announcement or government's decision kicks in, a whole student loan market is going to evaporate and disappear immediately. So people are protecting their profits and are looking for scapegoats. And I'm nowhere near the originator of the plan. I've had an opinion on higher education policy making as far back as 2007. My honors, in fact, investigated structural deficiencies of NSFAS while I was president of VETS. I did a master's in economic geography with some link to how higher education and local economic development could work together. I went on to do a PhD in higher education management. I'm just a mere body of opinion in a host of researchers who were contributing positively towards what they think can be an alternative to the current financial and academic genocide on poor and working class students.
So in your mind and that of those, the other academics you were working with, where was the 40 billion rand going to come from to fund higher?
That's the second list of fake news that the Sunday Times published. In fact, at the time when they were leaking stories, the cost of phasing in free higher education was 14 billion rand, 14, not 40. In fact, the current bill now, as announced, is 12.5 billion rand, including phasing in free higher education for poor and working class students coming from households earning between 0 and 350,000 rand. That's 90% of South African households. Again, phasing in complete free higher education for TVET colleges, and as well as increasing government's GDP proportional expenditure from 0.68% to 1% of the GDP in order to to deal with the gross underfunding of the sector as a whole. Because remember, the reason why fees have been going up high so much is because of the proportionally declining subsidies. So the lower the subsidy versus the hiking of fees, the more funds are transferred to students. So if you want to arrest the hiking of fees, you increase your GDP proportional expenditure in the form of subsidies. That is why right now what government announced is actually historic, because now you now have that subsidy is going to absorb the 8% increment on behalf of children from 95% of South African households, because 95% of South African households earn below 600,000 rand. So if people are interested in the details and the authenticity of the plan, they must focus on that. Right now you have a multi-billion rand industry kicking and screaming, trying to derail this smooth implementation.
You've said that already, Mr. Masutha.
Yeah.
Let's look at the figures here, because we're ending up having a very academic and ideological discussion here. We all know in principle that South African children need free higher education, right? You said this 40 billion rand came from the Sunday Times. In fact, it comes from Treasury. Michael Sachs was the man who put forward that figure of 40 billion rand.
Then he lied to you.
Oh, so this is the former Deputy Director General.
If Michael Sachs thinks that phasing in free higher education with first-year students, it costs 40 billion rand, then he needs to relook at his calculator. If you ask if DG of higher education, he will tell you that the announcement made by government costs 12.5 billion rand. Okay, 12.5. So really, the host of fake news
is unable. Government itself, of which Treasury is a part, is unable to calculate how much it actually needs.
Look, I've never heard Michael Sachs say that, but if he said that, then it means he needs to relook at his calculator, because the phasing in of free higher education as announced by government. I'm part of the technical committee that processed the report. The DG of higher education announced the figure 12.5 billion rand, which is but a mere drop in what is actually needed to address the complete underfunding of the sector in South Africa. That is what I'm telling you.
Let us argue from your point of view that it is 12.5 billion. Where is that 12.5 billion supposed to come from?
Yes. Now, South Africans have been looking at the funding of higher education from a false perspective. If you are going to tick boxes of the cost per head, you are going to find yourself in a neoliberal way of thinking. Free higher education funds itself. How? Number one, for every graduate you produce, you save in a lifetime of social grants and free housing, because the unemployment rate amongst graduates is less than 5%, which tells you now that there's a strong bond between graduates and being economically active. Economically active populations are not dependent on social welfare, which means every graduate you produce, you save in social grants, you save in free housing. But if you want a quick, if you increase the skills levy by 2%, you increase the corporate tax by 2%, you already have your 12.5 billion rand. Treasury will announce measures that it has decided upon itself during the budget vote. But let's not pretend as though free education is a threat to the economy. In fact, the opposite is the case. All countries around the world, particularly Scandinavian countries and Germany, that have invested in free higher education have buoyant public purses and are rated high in the World Economic Forum's Inclusive Development Index.
So it's the opposite is the case. Unemployment rate that we have, Mr. Masutha. So there's no guarantee that graduates who come out of the system who've benefited are going to be employed.
Well, statistics would beg to argue. If the unemployment rate amongst the youth is all the way up to 60%, but that amongst unemployed graduates is 5%, it tells us that there's a strong bond between a higher education qualification and being economically active, particularly in an increasingly modernized and service-based economy that requires a qualification as a precondition to any life of dignity. So no, let's speak figures, not rhetoric. Unemployment is low amongst graduates and extremely high amongst those who those who are in the NEET category, not in employment, education or training. And those people cannot be told that, sorry, in any case, a degree will not get your job. So that's just make sure you don't come in the first place. No, there is no evidence that points to that direction. In fact, evidence points to the contrary.
Yeah, it's interesting that it appears, based on media reports, that there was a lot of resistance to some of the ideas the President was exploring before his announcement. We understand it's possible that Michael Sachs actually left the Treasury Department based on his resistance to these ideas.
You know,
I just want to add to that. The Heyer Commission has also said that this kind of idea cannot be introduced with any immediacy. It's something that needs to be worked towards over a time. Are you saying that seeming experts in this field are completely wrong?
Yeah. They are not experts. They are just a body of opinion. Let's just clarify that part.
Are you not a body of opinion?
I'm just
yourself?
a body of opinion, which is exactly what I said when we started. Anyway, the point I'm making,
why should we believe you over other experts in the field?
You are not believing me because I'm not responsible for the announcement. I'm reacting to that announcement and I'm saying it's progressive, it's revolutionary and long overdue. But let's entertain what the judge said, to be more precise. The reason why President Zuma and this government is under fire for pronouncing on free higher education, it's because they have rejected a 150 billion rand scam which was going to be imposed on government through the income contingency loan model proposed by the judge. How? Because the judge says you can't afford to provide free higher education for poor and working class students who constitute a mere 45% of the university sector, but somehow you can afford to underwrite billions of rand in income contingency loans via commercial banks on behalf of every student, postgraduate, undergraduate, in public and private universities and colleges. That is inherently contradictory. When you ask the question, how much is it to fund the higher recommendation, in actual fact, the commission says that figure is imponderable. I'm sorry. That's almost saying like saying that this car is so affordable, I just don't know its price. In truth, underwriting loans on behalf of every student as listed there takes government expenditure from 405,000 students to 2 million students. You say 2 million students times 75,000 rand full cost of study, that's 150 billion rand by next year. So how is 12.5 billion rand, which has been announced, less affordable than the buoyant 150 billion rand loan scam, which was going to be imposed on an entire generation and an entire country? So that is the whole argument which you are saying is from experts has failed in Great Britain. In fact, the same report, if you read all 750 pages, tell you that the income contingency loan model failed in Britain to an extent that two-thirds of graduates in Britain graduate with 50,000 pounds worth of loans, and they battle to pay them back even when given 30 years. That whole debt, because it's guaranteed by the state, it goes back to the very same treasury which was refusing to fund students in the first place. But this time, that debt is owed to bankers and fellow loan sharks, and that is why you see this kicking and screaming.
In terms of the details of implementation, which people are now putting pressure on the president to reveal, I mean, do you have any more details than the rest of us do? Because you seem to be confident this is a very sound plan,
yes.
But students, as well as universities, seemingly don't know how this is going to play out come the start of the next semester. Let's
start with vice chancellors. Vice chancellors are elitist in their approach to everything. In fact, when Checkpoint asked Adam Habib about the higher education funding crisis, he said, "My name is not Jacob Zuma. Go to Jacob Zuma for the solution." Is that so? Now, President Jacob Zuma and his government have now responded to students' demands. Now, they are now kicking and screaming. They're saying, no, the most potent criticism that vice chancellors have come up with of this particular policy is that it's bad timing and we were not consulted. How is it bad timing when the president initiated this process in 2015 when students were protesting? The commission takes 2 years, he takes 3 years to process the report and announces. Was he supposed to take his entire term of office of 5 years to respond to students? So this is hypocritical. In truth, this is a very seamless process. Number one, students must ignore the EFF's publicity stunt, because here are the facts. 600,000 students would have written matric by now and waiting for their results. There are only 203,000 spaces at universities available. That number is critical. Why is it critical? Because it doesn't matter what happens, how students are funded. There is only 203,000 spaces available at universities for which you must have applied for prior to the closing deadline. Now, in South Africa, it's not a problem of a shortage of applicants. It's actually a shortage of space, because as we speak right now, 260,000 students have applied for NSFAS already oversubscribing the spaces that are available, number one. Number two, universities such as VETS can only take 6,000 first years, but they would have almost 100,000 applicants made. So there is no issue here. In fact, every student who is in matric now, or any student who wrote matric in the past and applied to university on time last year and applied for NSFAS and comes from the bottom 90% of South African households, that is, your parents combined earn below 350,000 rand, you are going in for free. You only need a letter of or a firm offer from the university, which is a condition for you to qualify for the free education grant in the first place. The people are saying, what's the process? Where's the plan? What plan? NSFAS just established a student-centered model. The grant allocation is processed centrally by NSFAS, not at universities. Universities were consulted on the following matter, that you are not going to increase fees for those who come from households earning between 0 and 600,000. That's about 95% of South African families, because government in its increment of subsidy will absorb that, which means that when they say we're increasing fees by 8%, they mean for 5% of South African families, which is correct, because the secret many people don't know is that families in the top 10% of South African households, amongst whom 95% of the wealth circulate, their children make up 55% of the student population. The uglier way of saying it is that the bottom 90% families, their children constitute a mere 45% of the student population. So it is true, universities will still want to increase that 8% because they still have about 35% of their student population, particularly the elite ones, who are coming from families earning above 600,000 rand. So let's speak about inequality in access and success patterns, and understand that the elitist manner with which these vice chancellors are responding to this matter is because they are defenders and protectors of the multi-billion rand loan scheme, which will evaporate the moment this free education happens. And you can go read that report if you want to confirm.
You don't feel that President Jacob Zuma's announcement has created the impression that regardless of whether you gain access to university through this process of applying, either being accepted or not, and the like, you don't think a lot of students who haven't gone through that process will be expecting to be able to pitch up at universities and be given free education, even though they may not qualify to apply or enter?
You are asking a very critical and constructive question. What government needs to do is to send this communication of the whole step-by-step process to all MECs in all provinces, all HODs and all principals, and use all radio stations, including these stations, to communicate to all South Africans that, listen, what we have done is four-pronged. We've increased GDP expenditure from 0.68% to 1% in order to deal with the underfunding of the sector, number one, which means that free higher education does not threaten the quality of higher education, contrary to Habib's views. Number two, we have felt that we must redefine the poor and the working class from 122 annual household income to 350,000 rand in order to deal with students who are called missing middle, when in fact they are victims of an outdated definition of who is poor and working class, which means all of you in matric, for as long as you applied and have been accepted, your firm offer from the university is your precondition to getting the funding. You can't have funding and you don't have a place at university. That's number two. But number three, when you get, the universities will be communicating to every student the moment results are uploaded. Nothing changes. The only thing that changes is that the government has done away with a loan regime which was milking the poor and the working class. And it's saying that those who qualify are now coming in the form of grants, provided you qualify to university. Sophistic. You see this EFF reckless call, it led to someone's mother passing away in 2012 in the queue. In actual fact, the University of Johannesburg, to its great credit, after that incident, it invested in serious technology to ensure that even after they have processed and offered all the firm offers to students, should there be 200 or 300 spaces available for anyone to apply late to UJ, there's something called uj.mobi. I don't know if this year they will have time to do it, but in the past years, they've been allowing anyone to apply using their .mobi from a cell phone. You can't ask somebody from Thohoyandou to use 800 rand to come to Gauteng to queue to a non-existent queue, when they could catch a small taxi with 50 rand to Thohoyandou, wait for the internet cafe, and if there's indeed time for late application, apply online and get the space. UJ responds immediately, okay, because that's how the university has become that sophisticated. But the elite ones like VET and Bostalenbosch, they must not play with people's feelings. Since when was there walk-ins in VET in the first place? So when they're saying there will be no walk-ins this year, was there walk-in the previous year? Was there? I've been president of VET since when I was a student there in 2011. There was never a walk-in there. In any case, they've ramped up entrance requirements so much so that almost 80% of those who are writing matric will never meet those entrance requirements as a way to blockade the poor against this. That should be the next target. So free higher education is a policy of a government. It's a seamless process. Free higher education, there is no one or two or three types of free education. There's only one type of of free education. A higher education system whereby neither the end user nor his or her family pays, but rather the paying for his or her education is a collective responsibility of society. And if it means we tax the rich and the corporates who rake trillions out of this country in order to fund everybody else, then so be it.
All right. Thank you for coming in to talk to us this
Thank you.
afternoon.
Thank
Centre
you
for
very
Emerging
much.
Researchers Director, M Masutha.